Hi everyone, welcome to another chapter recap. Today we are taking a look at the book of Numbers, specifically Numbers chapter 7 all the way to 31. We're almost getting through the entire book. We are recapping Bible Discovery TV from February 7th to 13th. So if you don't know, my name is Corie and I work with my family in a ministry called Bible Discovery. We have a TV show, it's on YouTube, it's online. Check in the description box below if you're interested. And we take people just like you through the Bible in a year every year. So if you've always wanted to read through the Bible, if you've always struggled to understand it, come with us. We will help you get that goal accomplished. And that is part of the reason why I'm here today on this Saturday morning is when the video is being released. And that is in case you've fallen behind, I'm going to get you caught right back up here today now so that next week you can just keep on going with the daily reading. I know sometimes it's a lot to cram into your busy day. So let's just do this. Let's get through it. Numbers chapter 7 all the way to 31. Chapter 7. Tribal leaders of Israel bring gifts to the tabernacle, but these aren't sacrifices. These are 6 covered carts and 12 oxen to pull the carts. So they're gifting these to the Levites, as the Levites are responsible for transporting the tabernacle and the things of the tabernacle. So that's what these offerings are for. There's a special note here that the Kohathites, this branch of the Levites, there's 3 branches of them. The Kohathites specifically are not given a cart or oxen because they're supposed to carry the temple furniture like the altar and the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders using frames and poles that they've constructed. So it's this whole idea that mankind physically bears the responsibility for communication with God, not animals or man-made things like carts. This is going to come back up in the next few books of the Bible with King David and some mistakes that he makes in trying to transport the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, we also learn about inaugural sacrifices that these tribal leaders then bring to celebrate the opening of the tabernacle. In chapter 8, we learn about the setting up of the tabernacle's lights, what we would call today the menorah of the tabernacle. And we also learn about the inauguration of the Levites for service. So remember, the priests, Aaron and his sons, they're Levites, but they're special Levites. They're the priests that are responsible for giving the sacrifices and offerings to God. The rest of the Levites are responsible for transporting and taking care of the actual tabernacle itself. So the material and the altar and the Ark of the Covenant and the tent pegs and the tools and all of that good stuff. So there's an inauguration of those Levites that occur there. There's a little bit of a number discrepancy here. Here in Numbers chapter 8, the age for service is said to be between 30 and 50 years. Those Levite men are the ones that are doing the work. Back in Numbers chapter 4, it's from ages 25 to 50. This is probably explained by a 5-year apprenticeship that would solve those numbers quite nicely. I know there's a few other ways to do it, but I think that one makes a lot of sense. In Numbers chapter 9, it's all about what to do if you are ceremonially unclean, and so you can't celebrate Passover. Remember, Passover was a command. Celebrating the feast of Passover was a command of God. So what do? God said, celebrate it the next month. So wait and celebrate it the next month. We learn about, again, this cloud on the tabernacle that would descend. It looked like a fire at night, a cloud by day. When it would leave the tabernacle that was in the middle of the camp, then the Israelites would pack up and move on. Numbers chapter 10, we learn about the silver trumpets that only the priests could use. They were used for signaling the Israelites to assemble for meetings, for feasts, for festivals, and they were also to be used in warfare to signal the troops, meaning that priests would always have to go into battle with Israel. In chapter 10, we also get a physical example of the Israelites packing up shop and moving the camp. So that's always interesting as well. We also learn here in chapter 10 as a little caveat that Moses convinced his brother-in-law, so Zipporah's brother, to stay with the Israelites. In Numbers chapter 11, the Israelites are complaining about their hardships, and this causes a fire from God to begin to kill people on the outskirts of town. Moses prays, and this stops. Then we have an instance of people complaining about food, and Moses seems to have had enough here. He goes to God and complains about the people, and he essentially says, I can't do this. I can't lead these people anymore. And God's response to Moses is to give power to 70 elders of Israel. God empowered them to help Moses with the people here. His response to the people's complaining is to bring a whole flock of quail, a few flocks of quail. To be honest, I'm really not sure how many quail would be in an average-sized quail flock. I'm not up on my quail numbers, but it seems to be quite a bit of quail here, and the Israelites kill and eat these quail, but a plague breaks out because of it. It's a common theme, the complaining and then the plagues. Okay, chapter 12 is a really big deal. Aaron and Miriam rebel against Moses' leadership. Aaron and Miriam are the brother and sister of Moses, so this is a family dispute. But more importantly than that, Aaron is the high priest of Israel, and Miriam is a prophet of Israel. In fact, she's one of two people in the Bible thus far who have been identified as a prophet of God. So this is a really big deal. And God, in his defense of Moses to Aaron and Miriam, actually doesn't even call Moses a prophet. He calls Moses better than a prophet, more than a prophet. He speaks to Moses face to face as to a friend. Miriam is given the consequence for this rebellion, so she must have been the main instigator. And she is forgiven by God after Moses prays for her, but she is ceremonially unclean and has to live outside of the camp for 7 days, so publicly shamed here, before she's allowed to come into the camp and they're allowed to move on. Now, this rebellion, this pushback against Moses's leadership is a bit of a mystery because Moses's Cushite wife. The question is, who's this Cushite wife? Because Zipporah, his wife that we know about, is said to have been a Midianite, and in fact the Midianite daughter of a priest. So what's going on here? There's a few theories. One is that Zipporah died and Moses got remarried to a Cushite. Another is that this is a previous wife from Egypt, because the Cushites lived near Egypt. The Cushites that we're used to thinking about. So that's another theory. And then there's another theory that Zipporah is the Cushite wife. Now, there's a few reasons that this can be justified, a few ways it can be justified. One of them is to look at the prophet Habakkuk in chapter 3, verse 7, where Cush and Midian are used interchangeably. Now, this is a very odd thing, and no one knows why, but perhaps there was a different Cush that was related to Midian. Perhaps it was a skin color thing. We're not really sure, but it is possible that Zipporah was the Cushite wife. Regardless, this was an ethnic issue. Moses had married outside of the covenant of Abraham, which the Israelites were not supposed to do. And when you ask the question, well, why now? Why would Aaron and Miriam bother to come against Moses' leadership at this point because of this issue? If you look back at chapter 11, verse 4, the complaining over food against God was not begun by native or ethnic Israelites. It was begun by the foreigners that were living with them. So this may have just been a convenient opportunity to jump on that bandwagon for Aaron and Miriam. All right. Numbers chapter 13, Moses, at God's command, sends out 12 men, or 12 spies, as we kind of traditionally say now, into the land of Canaan, the promised land, to seek it out. When they come back, 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, are good to go. They want the Israelites to go into the land. The other 10 of them are terrified. There's really strongly fortified walled cities. There's descendants of Anak, these big warriors. We're going to get into that a little bit later down the line in our recaps. They just don't want to do it. In chapter 14, Israel accepts the judgment of the 10 who don't want to be faithful to God. They're lamenting and mourning, and they actually want to choose a new leader who will lead them back to Egypt. And when Joshua and Caleb resist this, the Israelites want to stone Joshua and Caleb. And this whole debacle is interrupted by the glory of God descending on the tabernacle, this cloud descending on the tabernacle. And so God interrupts it, and he lets them know that the consequence of this rebellion, this rejection of his order and his authority, is that they are going to spend the rest of their lives in the wilderness, and it's going to be their children, that generation who came out of Egypt, they're all going to die, and it's going to be their children who God leads into the land of Canaan, plus a really old Caleb and slightly less old Joshua. They're going to make it in there as well. The Israelites do not like this answer, and so they try to go into Canaan on their own, without Moses, without the Ark of the Covenant, without any of their godly leaders, and they get beaten very badly. In Numbers chapter 15, we get into a little bit more liturgy here. We get the grain and the drink offerings, the grain and wine offerings that were supposed to accompany burnt offerings. And we learn more about what to do, what sacrifices to give for the unintentional sin of the whole community or of an individual. What do you do when someone's intentionally breaking the Sabbath? And also there's the wardrobe rules that the Israelites are supposed to wear tassels on their garments to remind themselves to be holy like God is holy. So that all happens in chapter 15. In chapter 16, we get a doozy. It's Korras Rebellion. So again, this is the aftermath of the Israelites' refusal to go into the promised land. There's this big, emotional, dangerous reaction and rebellion. Korah and a few men, Korah was a Levite, and a few ringleaders, plus some Reubenites and 250 community leaders of Israel, want to overthrow Moses and Aaron. And Korah specifically wants to go after the high priesthood. He wants Aaron's job. The men even say to Moses and Aaron, do you want us to be your slaves? So essentially they're saying, you brought us out of slavery in Egypt, but you didn't lead us into the promised land, and now we're going to live the rest of our lives in the wilderness. You are our new slave masters. We're basically your slaves. You're talking to God for us and then telling us his words. This is really convenient, Moses and Aaron. So they're accusing them like that. Of course, this doesn't go well. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, these ringleaders of this whole thing, the earth opens up and swallows them and their family and their tents and their households, and it's awful. And the 250 leaders have taken incense censers into the tabernacle, and they're burning it before God so that God will choose them as leadership. And of course he doesn't. Fire comes out from the presence of God, just like it did for Aaron's apostate sons. It does for these men as well. And brutally, these bronze censers that they had brought into the tabernacle, they're beaten into thin sheets and laid over the bronze altar of the tabernacle. So every time someone comes in to offer a sacrifice, they see the evidence of what happens when you rebel against God. In Numbers chapter 17, God's chosen leadership is demonstrated positively and very clearly. All of the tribes of Israel bring a staff with their tribal name carved into it into the tabernacle, including Aaron's. And in the morning, Aaron's staff has budded, flowered, and produced almonds miraculously. So this is a positive sign of who God has chosen. In chapter 18, then, we get what Aaron and his sons will get as an inheritance in Israel, because they're not going to get any land. So what do they get? That is answered in chapter 18. In chapter 19, we have the water of cleansing sacrifice and ritual, how you would purify someone after they became ceremonially unclean. In chapter 20, we get the deaths of Miriam and Aaron. Miriam dies at a place called Kadesh and is buried. Aaron dies on Mount Hor, and his son Eleazar takes on the role of high priest of Israel. In between the deaths of Miriam and Aaron, the people here at Kadesh, they run out of water, and this is that famous occasion where God tells Moses to go speak to the rock, and it will give water to the Israelites. And in defiance and in anger, Moses goes into the tabernacle, takes Aaron's budded staff, that symbol of God's authority or the leadership that God has chosen, brings it to the rock and hits the rock twice. So this is in defiance against God. And this is ultimately why Moses is not allowed into the promised land. In Numbers chapter 21, we have some attacks, physical attacks that happen against Israel. So the king of Arad attacks, captures some of the Israelites, but then the Israelites go and defeat the king of Arad, and they destroy the city of Arad. Then we get the bronze snake incident, where the people complain that they hate manna. They hate this bread from heaven that God has given them. They're sick of it. And God sends poisonous snakes into the camp, and they start to get bitten. And Moses sets up a bronze image of a snake on a pole. And when the Israelites look at that snake, they look at the symbol of their judgment. They acknowledge that sin, right? Then they are healed of that poisonous snake bite, which is really interesting. Okay, 2 other things. 1, there's a mention here and a quotation from something called the Book of the Wars of the Lord. No one knows what this is. It does not exist any longer. But based off of the quotes, it appears to be a collection of poetry recording the wars that the Israelites went through, at least in this wilderness wandering time period. So really interesting. Now, then Sihon, king of the Amorites, I always get that mixed up with Ammonites, so I'm being very clear here. Amorites. Sihon, king of the Amorites, attacks Israel, and then the Israelites capture all of their cities, all of the city of the Amorites, and they actually settle. They settle in these cities for a time, and they do the same with a man named Og, the king of Bastion. In chapter 22, this is making the nation of Moab quite nervous. They're watching all of these nations and cities, I should say cities, all these cities fall to the Israelites. So they hire a pagan prophet named Balaam to curse Israel. Now, Balaam tries to curse Israel, and it doesn't work. God won't let him curse Israel. So that's God ends up humbling Balaam by showing him that even Balaam's donkey can see more of the spiritual world that Balaam can. So that probably was a fun experience for Balaam. Chapter 23 and 24 is all about Balaam trying to curse Israel and not being able to curse Israel, and he ends up prophesying a blessing and that Israel will defeat 4 future enemy nations. So that's 23 and 24. Now, Numbers chapter 25, we see the Israelites indulging in sexual immorality with Moabite women. Now, we learn later on that this was the tactic of Balaam, the prophet Balaam. He realized he couldn't curse Israel, so he gave advice to the Moabites on how to get Israel to curse themselves. Genius. So the problem was not just the sexual immorality, it was that the Midianite women were inviting Israelite men to sacrifice and do rituals with their pagan gods, and the Israelites were. This ends with a plague, and Phinehas, the son of Aaron, taking charge in bringing condemnation on these actions. In Numbers chapter 26, there's another census of all the Israelite men, 20 years and up. This is that next generation of Israelites who are going to be going into the promised land. In chapter 27, we have 5 daughters of a man named Zelophehad. He was of the tribe of Manasseh. He died in the wilderness for his own sin, for his rebellion against God. But his daughters come to Moses and they say, "Our father had no son. We're it, and we want to have his inheritance in the promised land." And God grants, yes, women should be allowed to inherit property from their fathers, and an inheritance order is established here in chapter 27. We also learn that Joshua is to be the new leader of Israel, and he's commissioned and given some authority at this point while Moses is still alive. In Numbers chapter 28, it's a going back through all the sacrifices and festivals of Israel. So daily sacrifice, weekly, monthly, and then the 5 festivals of Israel. In chapter 30, we've got 2 more chapters to go. Chapter 30 is all about vows to God and who could give them. And men and women were allowed to give vows to God and were encouraged to give vows to God. But there was a caveat here for women. There was some protection from God granted to women. If you were unmarried and you were living under the authority of your father, or when you're married, if your father or your husband heard about your vow to God and they prevented you from fulfilling your vow to God, God was not going to hold that against you. God may hold it against your husband and your father based off of the circumstances that are detailed in chapter 30, but he's not going to hold it against you. Now, widows and divorced women who are out on their own legally are treated the same as men in this way. They are allowed to give vows to God, but they must uphold those vows. To not uphold them would be a sin. In chapter 31, God gives Moses his last mission before he's going to die. He's not going to be allowed to go in the promised land, and that is to fight the Midianites. So Israel does. 12,000 armed men go in, along with Phinehas, that very zealous priest, Aaron's son, and he takes the silver trumpets and the Ark of the Covenant into battle. There's a death record of the prophet Balaam, so he doesn't get off scot-free here. And then there's a very brutal record of all of the men, women, and sons of the Midianites being killed. Now, the justification here for killing the widows and the sons of the warriors of Midian, remember that widows were seen to carry on their husband's name through the first child they had by another man. So that first child was supposed to be counted as their dead husband's child. So to stop this from going on, they were all executed. Now, this excluded young women who were not married, and they were allowed to be brought into Israel, and they were allowed to marry. Now, they couldn't be mistreated. Later on in Deuteronomy, we're going to learn all about the rules for treating women who are prisoners of war. And just as a little spoiler, if they were married, they had to actually be married by Israelite men. They weren't allowed to be concubines or anything like that. They were given the legal protection and status as wives in Israel. So there is that, at least. That brings us to the end. We've got Numbers chapter 7 all the way to 31. I hope that you're ready now to go for next week. I gotta be honest, this week went by really quick. I'm recording this pretty late at night right now, because I myself had to get caught up to make sure that I was doing justice to this recap. So if you've fallen behind this week, I'm with you. I've got it. But you know what? I hope now we are all caught up and we're ready to go. Let me know down in the comments below how you're doing this week, how you're doing with your Bible reading. If you have any questions from the reading, please pop it down below. I'll do my best to answer your question, or at least point you in a direction of an answer. Okay, that's all for this week, and I'll see you in the next video.